And so there's this big chasm in the data between what the lens of toxicology is looking at, and then there's the real life scenario, which is, well, wait a second, we are being exposed to hundreds of different chemicals at extraordinarily low levels that on their own wouldn't matter, right? Like if you're just exposed to one endocrine disrupting chemical ever at a really low level, yeah, sure, that won't matter. Not going to be a big deal. But we're not exposed to one endocrine disrupting chemical one time in our lives. We're exposed to dozens, if not hundreds of them every single day of our lives, at every moment of our lives. And that's why chronic low dose exposures are so concerning.
Welcome to the Calorie Conundrum Podcast with Coach Strick. Join us as we expand the weight loss conversation to beyond just calories and dare to ask the question, why does eating less and exercising more sometimes not produce the desired results? Here's Coach Strick to discuss this Calorie Conundrum.
Welcome to the Calorie Conundrum Podcast. This is Coach Strick. And I'm super excited because on today's episode, we have the environmental toxins expert and educator, Lara Adler. As you will hear in this interview, environmental toxins are a very important and often overlooked health topic, and according to Lara, are the biggest missing piece of the health and wellness puzzle. Lara teaches health coaches, nutritionists, and other health professionals how to eliminate the number one thing holding their clients back from the results they are seeking, the unaddressed link between chemicals and chronic health problems. She trains practitioners to become experts in everyday toxic exposures so they can improve client outcomes without spending hundreds of hours researching on their own. Let's see what Lara has to say about environmental toxins and your weight.
Lara, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Excited to get into it.
So you might be excited, but I guarantee you're not as excited as I am because today's topic is an issue that by itself can put a nail in the coffin of the calories in, calories out mentality or philosophy.
Yeah.
A lot of people they've got their heels dug in on this idea of it's only about calories in, calories out. And this topic that you're an expert in kind of proves that wrong on so many different levels. And so that's why I'm so excited to have you on today. Lara is an environmental toxins expert. And if you don't know what that is, she's about ready to explain that.
I'll explain it. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you tell us, what is that?
Yeah. So environmental toxins, it's a little bit self-explanatory. There's toxins in the environment. More broadly speaking, when people hear that phrase environmental toxins, they're often thinking of, air pollution and oil spills and soil contamination. And those are environmental toxins. That's part of what's under the umbrella. And then there's also environmental toxins within the context of how we live our everyday lives. So in our food, in our personal care products, in our household cleaners, in the building materials that are in our homes, in the water that we drink. And so we're surrounded by toxins or toxicants, chemicals in our environment that can have a negative impact on our health, environmental health, health of animals and wildlife. So that's sort of broadly speaking what the field of environmental health is looking at within the context of toxins. This field of research, environmental health, environmental medicine, all the little different facets of it, is really specifically focused on the chemicals out there that are known to or are suspected of causing harm. I think the term chemicals, the word chemicals everything is technically a chemical. And so people kind of get like, ooh, water, dihydrogen monoxide is a scary chemical. That's water. So everything is a chemical. And so what we're talking about are not, quote unquote, all chemicals are bad. We're talking about the bad chemicals in the field of environmental toxins.
Yeah. So like you said, this stuff can be kind of overwhelming because the more you research it, the more you get into it, the more you realize that everything is actually killing us in one way or another. I mean, you can overdose on water.
Yes. Yeah. It definitely is an overwhelming topic. The more you know, the more you kind of have this like, okay, well, we're all going to die vibe. And yeah, we are all going to die. Like that's the only, truth to life, is that there is an end to it. That's not our goal, is obviously not to reach that end quickly. And it can be overwhelming when we start to see just how pervasive the exposures are. The CDC operates their human biomonitoring studies. They've been running these for decades, where they're looking for and measuring the levels of certain chemicals in the human population. And some of the chemicals that we're exposed to are found in 95, 98, 99% of the population. So we know that exposure is ubiquitous, and that chemicals are, making their way from whatever source that they're in, if it's a product or it's a water or air pollution, into our bodies, and then having, in some cases, biologic impact once they're in there. And so when people start learning about that and all of the places they're exposed, there is this fear, anxiety, and overwhelm that comes up for a lot of people, because we feel like, well, it's inescapable, and it's not. We can't. It's not totally inescapable, right? There are a lot of things that we can do to minimize our exposure, and that's really what my focus is on, helping primarily health professionals know how to do that within their client or patient population base.
Yeah, so you mentioned it a few before at the beginning of what exactly we're talking about, and you said oil spills and pollution and whatnot, but
Yeah.
what are some of the things that we as personal people living in our own lives,
Yeah.
what should we be concerned about in regards to these environmental toxins?
The short answer is like all of them, but that's not super helpful. So I think that where we can have so there's two layers to this conversation, and we're going to keep this focused primarily on the individual level, but there's also the societal level, which is absolutely critical to also talk about, but it's a little bit outside of like, what is it within the realm of an individual person like me and like you to affect change. And so we can focus our conversation on like, what can the individual person do to minimize their exposures? And that starts with understanding where those exposures are happening. And so, to your question, we're being exposed to environmental chemicals just through living our normal everyday lives, through, like I said, the use of personal care products, through the consumption of foods that have contamination with, say, for example, pesticide residues or heavy metals or mycotoxins like molds. We have chemicals that are in our drinking water that are pretty common. We think we live in a highly developed nation, that we have really good water. That's not always the case. So I try to look at what we're being exposed to through the lens of where can an individual have the most impact on their own life, right? So if we're saying like, oh, well, your house was built with MDF or laminate flooring that's off-gassing formaldehyde, well, there's not that much that somebody's going to be able to do about that, short of ripping up the floors in their homes, which is not a realistic recommendation to make to somebody. And so I look through the lens of, let's prioritize this conversation around what are you being exposed to the most frequently? That has the easiest solution. And so if we look at it through that lens, then we're looking at what's in our food. We're looking at plastics, for example, plastics that we, whether we're heating our food in plastic containers or putting all our leftovers in plastic containers. We have migration of chemicals from those plastics into our food, and those chemicals can be endocrine disrupting. They can be obesogens, like you'd mentioned earlier, that brings us right into this conversation about chemicals influencing metabolism in ways that can alter or lead to weight gain, right? So that kind of butting up against that chemicals, not calories, or calories in, calories out mindset that a lot of people still are married to. So plastics is one, seafood contamination, fragrances in your home, scented candles, air fresheners. Like these are just normal things that people encounter every single day. I'm happy to get into specific chemicals that are in these products or talk about, how these chemicals might be linked to metabolic issues. We can kind of go down lots of different paths here.
Yeah, I want to get into all of that for sure.
Yeah.
But before we get there, I think one thing that's going to come up in people's minds besides being overwhelmed is the fact that it's just a little bit.
Right.
There's not much of this in here, so it's not gonna. I'm not worried about this because it's not enough to harm me. Can you talk about the difference between the acute toxin exposure and the chronic low-level exposure?
Yes. Yeah. And this is a pretty fundamental concept for people to wrap their head around so that they can navigate the conversation about toxins with a little bit more of basis in what the reality is. So acute toxicity is, somebody has, for example, maybe an occupational exposure that leads to some kind of acute reaction. And that's something that might require a hospitalization or a phone call to poison control, had a severe allergic reaction, or, you have nausea or vomiting or dizziness or your hair's falling out. Like those are pretty acute symptoms. And those absolutely occur within the context of environmental exposures, but they typically happen in like occupational settings. So somebody working occupationally in agriculture, applying pesticides or herbicides, that is a much higher level of exposure than most people are getting. And those can result in very acute symptoms. And sometimes those acute symptoms are death. So we'll take a little bit of a hard left turn here to just point out that, for example, in I think it's in India specifically, because of issues with agricultural industry and the government suppressing crop prices and all kinds of stuff like that, farmers drink pesticides as a means of suicide. The number one way that farmers commit suicide in India is by consuming pesticides. That's obviously a very acute physiological reaction, is death, right? So that's not the side of the spectrum of the conversation that I'm talking about. I'm talking about those chronic exposures. And the chronic exposure conversation slides into what you just said about like, well, these small doses, it don't really matter. It's just a little bit, right? And so that idea that only a small amount is in these products, it won't hurt us, is really leaning on the dose makes the poison adage, which is the sort of foundational dogma within toxicology, right? And toxicology is the field of science that determines whether or not something, or the levels at which something becomes toxic. And they really kind of rest their whole foundation on this concept that the dose makes the poison. And this is a true but partial statement. So for some exposures, a large amount is absolutely going to be worse than a small amount, no question. So if you're talking about something like radiation, right? A little bit of radiation, like, okay, yeah, we get radiation from eating bananas. There's naturally present radiation in bananas, but we can tolerate that. But you have radiation poisoning from nuclear weapons or too many x-rays or whatever it is, and that can be very damaging. So more is worse, less we can handle. So many things follow that kind of path. When we start looking specifically at what are called endocrine disrupting chemicals, or chemicals that interfere with the human endocrine system or mammals' endocrine systems, the behavior of those chemicals is very different, and it really kind of turns that concept of the dose makes the poison inside out. And the reason for that is that hormones are the communicators of our body, right? So they're messengers. They tell the body, go do this, go do that. And, we've got hormone receptors, estrogen receptors, et cetera, all throughout our body. And that communication system in our bodies it operates at very, very low levels. So the volume of estrogen, for example, or estradiol, or whatever that's flowing through our bodies is happening at like parts per trillion levels. So extraordinarily low levels. Why? Because that's the way our biology works. It's not intended to respond to large volumes of hormones. It's intended to respond to these really tiny levels. I like to explain it to say our hormones are communicators, but they communicate in whispers. It's really quiet, right? Like it's just real quiet. They're not shouting. They just do their job at really low levels. Endocrine disrupting chemicals are chemicals that mimic or block our natural hormones. Right. So they are, and oftentimes they're molecularly similar to our hormones. So our bodies can't tell the difference between, say, estradiol and BPA because the molecules are real similar. And so if we know that the human body responds to natural hormones at extraordinarily low levels, and we also know that endocrine disrupting chemicals can be bioactive at extremely low levels, then those extremely low levels that we're being exposed to every day through our personal care products and pesticide exposures to our food, we suddenly start to see those through a different lens because we're going, well, wait a second, that's the levels at which we're being exposed at the same types of levels that our bodies actually know how to work with. Larger levels of exposure to something like BPA, it's not that it won't be toxic, it just won't be toxic in the same way, right? So they're not going to, toxicologists who are studying extraordinarily high levels of chemicals, they actually don't study the chronic low level exposures that we get. They don't do that. And so the data that we have to show that chemicals are quote unquote safe is only looking at this through this assumed lens that, oh, more is always going to be bad. And we're going to kind of back our way down in our research studies to find a level that's like maybe not that bad. And then we're like, we don't see any more harms. We're going to keep backing down. They factor in a safety margin. And then they go, great, it's safe below that. But they never actually test below that. It's an assumption that they don't test, right? And so there's this big chasm in the data between what toxicologists, the lens of toxicology is looking at, and then there's the real life scenario, which is, well, wait a second, we are being exposed to hundreds of different chemicals at extraordinarily low levels that on their own wouldn't matter, right? Like if you're just exposed to one endocrine disrupting chemical ever at a really low level, yeah, sure, that won't matter. Not going to be a big deal. But we're not exposed to one endocrine disrupting chemical one time in our lives. We're exposed to dozens, if not hundreds of them every single day of our lives, at every moment of our lives. And that's why chronic low dose exposures are so concerning.
Yeah, there's a lot of information there.
Yeah,
but
it's a lot.
That's definitely something for people to think about, because like you said, these things are everywhere. And what you were describing, I'm sure you know about this, but Dr. Brian Walsh, he brought an idea or a subject or a topic called non-monotonic dose response.
Yes, and that's what endocrine disruption is essentially.
Yeah, and so basically what that means is, like you have a hill, like a, what's that thing called, the 80-20, what I'm talking about, with the spectrum, where 80% is like in the
bell curve.
Yeah, like a bell curve.
Yeah.
And so like a very high dose is causing symptoms, but then there's also a part of like low dose is causing similar symptoms, or some kind of symptom.
So there's an easy way to just sort of describe the difference between monotonic and non-monotonic dose response curves. And so what I was describing with, say, radiation, right, that more is worse, and less is not that bad. That is a linear dose response curve. So as the dose goes up, the response goes up. As the dose goes down, the response goes down. So it's linear, it's predictable. And that's the key, that it's predictable. We can predict its behavior because we've tested it at all levels.
Yeah.
Right. And radiation is something that we've tested at low levels because we're trying to find the levels that, for something like a dental x-ray, like how many dental x-rays can somebody get in their life without it burdening their cancer risk, for example. And so we do test those at really low levels, but chemicals, we test very differently. And so that is a predictable linear dose response curve, either a positive relationship or a negative relationship. The shape of the curve doesn't change. Monotonic, one direction.
Yeah.
Non-monotonic dose response curves can be bell-shaped, U-shaped, like an upside down bell, or it can be kind of undulating, like it changes depending on the dosage. And within toxicology, toxicologists, generally speaking, dismiss the presence of non-monotonicity. They're like, that's not real. However, if you talk to any pharmacologist or endocrinologist, they're going to go, yeah, no, that's absolutely real, because that's how pharmaceuticals are often made. So tamoxifen, for example, is a breast cancer drug, and it has a very well-known non-monotonic dose response curve, and that's the way it works. And so in the beginning, the dose of tamoxifen doesn't really do anything. And then as the dose increases, it actually causes a flare, what's called the tamoxifen flare, where patients who are on it actually have a increase in like breast tenderness, and their tumors grow. And then only after they've reached another point on the dose curve does the tamoxifen actually start to work. And so it does have a little bit of this bell shape. And we know that to be true. And so, this is where, again, not every endocrine disrupting chemical necessarily has that non-monotonic dose response curve, but we're seeing that it exists. And the problem is, if we're looking at a dose response, it's hard to do this without visuals, right? But if we're looking at a dose response curve, when we got the X and Y axis, toxicologists, again, they start at like, we're going to dose animals with 10,000 times the amount of chemical. Why? Because they only have 3 months to do a study, because they're not going to do a 2-year longitudinal rodent study, because that's a lot of money, a lot of time. And they're like, well, I'm not going to do the study for that long if I know I'm not going to get results, because I need to get published, because that's how science works. That's the field of science, right? It's not actually how science works, but and so, or the industry of science works. And so toxicologists will dose rodents extraordinarily high levels, enough that could kill them. And they're like, okay, wow, that kills them. That's the LD 50% of the lethal dose 50% of the rodent population dies. Okay, that's bad. Let's keep backing it down. We'll pick a couple lower levels of exposure. And they're looking for 2 points, what's called the low L and the no L. The low L is the lowest observed adverse effect level. That's the lowest point at which they start seeing adverse effects. They go a little bit beyond that, and they find what's called the no L, which is the no observed adverse effect level, meaning at this level, we are not seeing any adverse effects. Then they factor in margin of safety to say, like, oh, let's just to be on the safe side, we'll factor in a little bit lower on that dose response curve. And then they set the safety level. This is the level that you can be exposed to safely, except they never actually test the safety level directly. They don't test it, and they don't look beyond it. Well, non-monotonicity tends to exist in that place that they don't test. So it's kind of like, well, if you don't test, you won't know, right? And I want to go back to this term adverse effect, right? I mentioned no and the lowest and the no observed adverse effect level. So toxicologists are looking for an adverse effect. What's that? Death, cancer, tumors, changes in organ weight, gross histological changes. That's what they're looking for. They're not looking for slight alterations in hormone that might lead to a thyroid disease, that might lead to diabetes. They're not looking for the type of endpoints that are reflective of the type of illness that's present in the human population on a daily basis. Does that make sense? Like, there's major gaps in the way that this toxicology research is done, in my opinion. And it's unfortunate because all of our regulatory decisions that determine the quote unquote safe levels of chemicals in commerce are relying on that data.
Yeah, and that's of what they've tested as well.
Of what
So
they've tested, yes.
yeah, so there's tens of thousands of chemicals that they haven't even tested, so they have no idea if it's bad for us or not. And so for the ones they have tested, they've only tested high doses and not like all the smaller doses as well. And then that leaves out all the other chemicals that they haven't even got around to testing.
Right. Yeah.
And
So we've very much backed ourselves into a pretty bad corner in terms of, at this point with this many chemicals on the market, it's going to take an extraordinarily enormous joint effort from all countries around the world. And I don't think that is going to happen anytime soon. We're never going to reach a place of perfection when it comes to chemical management. And that's because the chemical industry is one of the largest lobby groups in the world, and they work really, really hard to make sure that federal policy or policies around the world suit them and favor them, so they can generate more profits. And that's it.
Yeah, and so that's why it's real. Like one of the points of this podcast and the message I'm trying to get across to people is why it's really important for us as individuals to take the responsibility of finding this information and utilizing it to better our health, and not relying on outside sources to enforce laws or pass laws that help us be healthier, because these people are making money on it. So why would they want to regulate themselves,
Right.
Like,
and so I would actually counter that a little bit, because yes, if we are privileged enough to have the ability to make changes in our daily lives to minimize our exposures, yes, let's always do that. Let us always do that. But there are millions of people around the world that do not have the privilege to be able to do that. They can't go out and buy all of the gut supportive supplements and the mitochondrial support supplements, and they can't go buy organic food and their non-toxic skincare products because they just don't have access or resources to those. And we don't want to leave that entire population out kind of flapping in the breeze. And so it's a yes, and if we have the capabilities of modifying our own lives in ways that can minimize our own exposures, yes, let's do that. And let's push for policy change in as many ways as we can, so that we can help out the people who don't have the privilege that we do to navigate this space. Because it is very much a privilege to be able to say, oh, I'm going to go buy a $400 water filter reverse osmosis system, when most people, like, I think that part of it's a yes and for me. It's always going to be a yes and.
Yeah. And I completely understand you, but I know how things work.
Yeah.
So.
And, I think that there's layers to this, and we will meander our way back to the obesogenic chemicals side of the conversation. But, consumer demand is always going to move faster than legislation. We know that. So that's the benefit of the individual making better choices and demanding better choices, because we see big changes in a lot of these big box stores that we like to kind of poo-poo because they're terrible, and they are. And also, when Costco is the largest seller of organic foods, that tells us something. When CVS and Target and Walmart and all of these big stores, Walgreens, start instituting policies to minimize the use of toxic chemicals in their store brand products, which they all have started to do, it's because of consumer demand. And so that's like, it's a yes and here too. Like, yes, sure, we want to push for legislative change, and we want to, on the local level, right, we want to ask our local politicians, like, where do you stand on these issues? Because that's how we make change for everyone, not just for ourselves.
Yes. So I know we talked about like a high level view of these toxins, and you mentioned like things like plastic, seafood, fragrances. What is in these things that are the toxins? What are we dealing with specifically?
Yeah. So with plastics, it depends on what type of plastic. So most commonly, we're thinking through the lens of BPA or phthalates. So both of these chemicals are ubiquitous in the marketplace, and both of them are highly present in the human body. So bisphenols, and it's a family of chemicals. It's not just one. Bisphenol A is just the one that people often know about. Is primarily found in hard shatterproof plastic, so polycarbonate plastic. This is number 7 other category of plastics. It's not found in like Poland Spring bottles, despite the fact that people, including journalists, all the time, they're writing articles about BPA, and then the headline images of like a Poland Spring bottle. And I'm like, damn it, there's never BPA in those. You're misrepresenting, and now people are confused. There might be BPA in the cap, but there's probably not any in the bottle. So BPA's job in plastic is to make the plastic rigid and hard, right? To add a sturdy component to it. It's also found in canned foods. So in the lining of canned foods, whether that's soup or tomatoes or beans or beer or whatever, the interior of that can is coated with an epoxy resin that's intended to keep the food away from the aluminum surface so that it doesn't eat away at the aluminum, cause little air holes that will lead to things like botulism in the can. So it's a protective measure that has a negative consequence of having BPA and similar chemicals leach. It migrates out of the lining into the food. There was a study looking at measuring the BPA levels in urine from people that were eating canned foods, and they saw a 229% spike in BPA from eating a canned soup. And the reason why we see certain types of either canned foods or plastics, like maybe our plastic Tupperware container or what have you, be an exposure source is because certain types of foods are going to increase the leaching of those chemicals. So the analogy that I always give, and this is not specifically BPA, but it's a good visual, is that like orange stained piece of Tupperware that everybody always has, right? Where you like put tomato soup in it or pasta sauce or whatever. And then forever afterwards, it's stained orange. You can run it through the dishwasher. It's still orange. The reason for that is because whatever tomato-based product that you put in there to stain it orange, tomatoes are acidic. It's usually hot when it goes into the container. So you take it off the stove and you pour the hot leftovers in the container. And it usually has oil in it. So heat, oil, and acidity are 3 of the things that increase the migration of chemicals and plastics out into the food. And so if you've got all 3 in one, kind of makes this bad situation. And so the reason why you can't ever get the orange stain off is because those lycopene dyed oil molecules have physically embedded themselves into the matrix of the plastic. So they're not on the plastic, they're in the plastic. And if molecules can get into the physical matrix of the plastic, that also means that molecules from the plastic can get into your sauce. And so when we have things like canned soup, which is always packed when it's hot, if it's a tomato-based soup, then it's acidic and it's usually got some fat content in it. And so that is why we see a big spike with certain types of foods from BPA. It's because those foods are likely pulling out more of that or leaching more of that bisphenols. And BPA, this is not within the plastics conversation, but BPA is also used in thermal paper. So thermal cash register receipts can be a significant, potentially significant source of BPA exposure, especially if somebody works as a cashier, right? And they're handling receipts all day, then that can be problematic. So BPA is an endocrine disrupting chemical. It, among other things, is also an obesogenic chemical. And so we can kind of get into some of that discussion of what are obesogens. We can do that. I can come back to that in a second, but I'll go to some of these other chemicals that we're talking about, like phthalates, for example. So that's BPA. BPA is found in hard shatterproof plastic. So like your Vitamix or your food processor bowl or your like travel Starbucks cup, those type of plastics. other plastics, things like a Poland Spring water bottle, or maybe like your ketchup bottle or your ketchup container, those typically contain plasticizers whose job it is to make that plastic soft, right? So you can squeeze it. So there's hard plastic and soft plastic. So soft plastics typically rely on chemicals called phthalates, which is another class of chemicals. It's not a chemical, there's dozens of them. And those chemicals are also endocrine disrupting, well-established endocrine disrupting chemical. BPA is probably the most studied, so we have the most data on that, but phthalates, I would say, probably comes at a close second. So we have tremendous amount of hundreds and hundreds of studies on both of these chemicals, showing that they're both, pretty significant endocrine disrupting chemicals. BPA is found in, I think it's 93% of the population. Phthalates, I think it's 98. So they are ubiquitous. Phthalates are also found in scented products around the home. So scented candles, air fresheners, laundry detergents, kitchen cleaners, your makeup, your deodorant. So you can see why that exposure is so ubiquitous, because we're being exposed to it at all sort of points along the day. So those are, I can stop there. I can keep going.
If you think those are like the two main ones, then yeah, that's fine.
It's hard to say main ones. They're just two of the most common ones.
Okay, yeah.
Because somebody might have, based on their profession, maybe they're working as a firefighter. So I'll use a firefighter as an example. Firefighters have extremely high levels of exposure to PFAS chemicals. These are perfluoroalkyl substances. They're used in firefighting foams, which is why they have occupationally much higher levels than the rest of the population. And PFAS chemicals are also endocrine disrupting and obesogenic. So, it might depend on which chemicals you encounter, and maybe either from your profession, or again, if you're a cashier, then maybe BPA is an exposure that you're getting more of than somebody else. So, but those are some of the most common ones. And so this idea going into this conversation about obesogenic chemicals and metabolism and like, how does that work? How do we, how is that a thing? Is, the idea that chemicals might make us fat, right? Or that might alter our metabolism in ways that predispose us to weight gain. When we think about toxic chemicals being able to do that, we kind of think like, well, that's a little bit silly. How's that work? If we look at pharmaceuticals, we know this is not a debatable topic. Everybody understands that certain pharmaceuticals have a side effect of weight gain, right? That's just well established. Antidepressants are notorious for this, right? You get put on an antidepressant, you're normal weight, and then suddenly you start putting on, 10, 20, 30 pounds, and you struggle to get that weight off. And that's referred to as chemically induced weight gain. So we know this idea that chemicals can alter our metabolism or alter our fat cell production. We know that to be factually true. So it's not a departure or a big leap for us to say, hey, are there chemicals that we're exposed to through our consumer products or food or water that might also do the same thing? And the answer is yes. And so to date, I think there's around 20 or 30 chemicals that have been identified as having these properties of being able to make us fat or alter our metabolism in ways that can make us fat. And there's lots of different ways that they can do that. One of the ones that I find to be the most fascinating and probably one of the more important ones is through activation of the Ppark gamma receptor in the body, which is sort of the master regulator of fat cell development. And when this receptor is active, or Ppark gamma is activated within the presence of fat cells that are already sort of fat cells, right? We have fat cells in our body. Ppark gamma can change the sort of programming of that cell to allow it to have a larger capacity for fat storage, right? So it's not changing the cell in any other way other than it's making it bigger and able to hold more fat. And so if we know that to be true, then we can see, okay, well, that's just a fat cell that's getting bigger, because fat cells don't typically change size. They're just a fat cell, except in the presence of Ppark gamma activation, and then it can. And so we can see that that is essentially cellular weight gain. If Ppark gamma is active or activated in the presence of a stem cell, then it can change the direction of where that cell was going to go. So instead of becoming a skin cell or a bone cell or an eyeball cell, it's going to be it's going to say, you know what, we're going to just make you into a fat cell. And so what happens is not only do we have an increase in the number of fat cells, but those fat cells have a larger capacity for fat storage. So there's two different ways right there where we can see that this chemical exposure can lead to weight gain, this sort of chemically induced weight gain. And this has nothing to do with what you're eating. It's nothing to do with food consumption. This is a chemically induced weight gain. And we also see, and this is, for people that are on their own, journey for health optimization or weight loss or whatever, this aspect won't necessarily apply to them. This is more of a for future generations, because we are seeing obviously rates of childhood obesity, tripled since the 1970s. So major problem there. But it's the prenatal exposures, the in utero exposures to these same chemicals can actually set children on a path to struggle with their weight for their entire lives, right? Because we've altered the programming of their fat cell development, right from the beginning. And in rodent studies, when they either activate certain genes or are able to, or expose them to these obesogenic chemicals, sometimes what they find is that if the exposed and unexposed or control group are given the same diet, like the obesogenic chemical exposed rodents are going to put on more weight on the same diet. You introduce a high fat diet and like the sort of standard American diet profile, those exposed rodents put on even more weight than the control group, who's going to maybe put on a little bit more weight in the presence of this higher fat diet. But this exposed group is really going to pack it on. And so, this can somehow likely explain why it is that some people, you get two different people with two different life experiences and exposomes, right? Like this bigger picture of all the things they've ever been exposed to, or their parents were ever exposed to, or grandparents were ever exposed to. And one can eat whatever they want and never put a pound on. And then the other person is like, oh, I just had one sweet, and they're starting to put on all this weight and they just struggle no matter what they eat. And so that might explain some of that difference that people are really sort of saddled by, and where they start attaching self-worth, right? Like, oh, I can't do it. I suck. And it's biology. It's chemistry and biology. And maybe you got dealt a bad set of cards because of behaviors and activities that, we didn't know 30 years ago or 40 years ago, that, hey, maybe parents shouldn't be, or people shouldn't be smoking, right? For example, right? Everybody smoked 40 years ago. So yeah, so this Ppark gamma activation is one way that some of these chemicals can cause shifts in our metabolism. They can, other ways is they can, BPA, for example, can interfere with leptin and ghrelin. These are the hormones that your body uses to tell you to signal when you're full or not, or hungry. And so if we have chemicals that are interfering with our signals telling us that you're full, well, maybe we are going to have more calorie consumption or calorie intake. So, it's like so many things, it's a yes and. We're not just talking about chemically induced weight gain. So this whole idea of calories in, calories out, that's not the whole picture. And unfortunately, to your point in the very beginning, a lot of people are still like, no, that's the whole picture. That's it. And that's not the case. But that doesn't mean that concept is untrue. It's just not the only truth. Yeah. Right. And so again, if we have chemicals that are messing with our satiety signals, which BPA can do, that's a problem. You'll also have fat storage. Many of these toxins are fat soluble. Where do they go? They go into your body's adipose tissue. What happens if you don't have enough adipose tissue to safely store those toxins? your body's going to say, well, shit, we better start putting on some fat because we have all these toxins and I don't want them going to your brain or your other important organs. So we're going to start putting on adipose tissue. And it's sort of a protective mechanism in a way, but it also is backfires on us.
Yeah, this is great. I mean, what you just, speech you just gave, we could have broke that down into 4 or 5 different topics and talked
100%.
for hours on each one.
Yes.
And so I want to simplify it a little bit. Basically, what she's talking about is what I've mentioned in many podcasts before, but I've never actually spoke, specifically about it, and that's obesogens. And I've said, in past podcasts that these obesogens are substances in their environment in which, when exposed to them, cause weight gain. And so she gave the example of the rodents. And you also used the example of comparing one person to another. But to simplify this example, if you had a magic wand and could clone yourself and make the exact same person, and you expose one of yourself to obesogens and the other one not, the one exposed to obesogens is going to gain weight easier, eating the same amount of food and doing the same amount of exercise. So that's like the simple, like what she's saying.
It's super simplified, and I'll add, may, right? May, not will lead to obesity, but may, right? Because, one of the things that's challenging specifically about endocrine disrupting chemicals or hormone disrupting chemicals is they can mess us up in so many ways. And like the same chemicals. So phthalates linked to breast cancer, linked to early onset puberty, linked to heart disease, linked to cancers, linked to obesity, diabetes. And so somebody who's exposed to, say, phthalates isn't going to develop all of those conditions. It depends on where their sort of genetic weak links are or where their issues are. So if somebody, is already has other risk factors for breast cancer, that exposure might kind of push that breast cancer outcome. For other people, it might push a metabolic outcome. And so we don't ever actually know which path or which paths, plural, these exposures might lead to. So I always like to say it may lead as opposed to will, because we can't make definitive statements because we don't know. We don't know with a lot of this stuff. We're just only starting to dig into the literature and or into the research and try to figure it out.
Yeah, exactly. And everyone's different. I've said that, 1,000 times as well. Is every person's different. And like you said, things are going to affect different people different ways, and your genetic weak links and all that kind of stuff. But the simple idea is potentially these chemicals could cause you to gain weight easier or make it harder for you to lose weight than if you weren't exposed to them. And that's why I think it's so important for people to learn about these and know about them, because without that information, then you're just being exposed and dosing yourself with these chemicals that are causing these like weight loss resistance and stuff that if you don't know about it, then you can't do anything about it. But
and I think it depends on what look, I always look at, if you want to reduce exposure to environmental chemicals to help on a weight loss journey, that is also going to help you with hormones, with other disease risk degrees. So it is like, to me, it doesn't matter whether you have an autoimmune condition or you have a child on the developmental spectrum or you have a weight problem. Minimizing your exposure to chemicals is going to be important for all people at all stages of life, for so many different reasons. And so, I really, unfortunately, addressing toxins tends to be kind of like the last stone that people turn over on their health journey, right? Like maybe they start with pharmaceuticals and that doesn't work. And then they go to natural health and they're looking at nutrition and fitness, and maybe that helps a little, but it doesn't help all the way. And then they look at lifestyle and meditation and sleeping. And then only after those things still continue to not get people where they are, do people start going, well, what else am I missing? And they go, oh, is it a parasite? Is it a heavy metal? Is it toxins? Right. So this is sort of like the last or later steps on the journey. And my hope is to push this to the front of the conversation, not so that people have to wait till they're really sick to deal with it, and to instead be a little bit preventative in, let's just minimize our exposures in the ways that we can, and again, recognize the privilege of being able to do that if we are able to kind of be proactive and buy safer products and buy better foods. If we can do that, let's do that.
Exactly. And I think that's why you said in your obesity masterclass that these environmental toxins are the biggest missing link of the health and wellness puzzle. So, yeah, exactly. Like, and the important part that, in what you just said, I think, is that the chronic low level idea that we discussed earlier, and the fact that it's not going to kill you if you have, some kind of chemical once or in minute amounts, short period of times, but it's that over 20, 30 years of consuming the same stuff. And like you said before, some of these things are actually being stored in the body.
Yeah.
So your toxic load is just going up and up and up. And so by the time, a symptom or a disease actually manifests, you're full of these things.
Yeah. And it's there's some interesting stuff on that topic. So, there's persistent chemicals and non-persistent chemicals. So persistent chemicals are like those PFAS ones, those perfluoroalkyl substances that firefighters, for example, are occupationally exposed to. Things like DDT, right? The reason that we're still seeing metabolites of DDT in babies, even though it was banned in the 1970s, is because it's a highly persistent chemical that doesn't break down. PFAS chemicals are referred to as forever chemicals. That's their moniker, right? Because why? Every molecule that's ever been created still fucking exists. That's the way it is. Nice job, chemists. Then there's non-persistent chemicals, and these are chemicals that they don't build up in the body. And so BPA, for example, is non-persistent. Phthalates are non-persistent. Most of the organophosphate pesticides are non-persistent. And so the best way to address those is to minimize exposure. And so I'll give you an example, like BPA has a half-life in the human body between like 6 and 12 hours, which means that any amount that we take in, it's going to take 6 to 12 hours to be reduced by half, 6 to 12 hours more for that half to be reduced by half. So that's how that breaks down. And so we pee it out really quickly. Comes in, we start metabolizing it right away, which is great. Our bodies can deal with that. Two things. One, the reason why 93% of people, according to the CDC, have metabolites of BPA in their urine at all times, or at any given time, I should say, is because we're being exposed constantly. So we never actually have a window of time to give our body a chance to fully excrete it, because we're just adding more in faster than, it's like a bucket, right? You're filling it faster than it can drain. And so then it overflows. So that's point one. Point two is, even in the short amount of time that an endocrine disrupting chemical like BPA is in the body, even in that short amount of time, it can cause problems. So there's an excellent book called Sicker, Fatter, Poorer by Dr. Leonardo Trasandi, who's a pediatrician and environmental toxins researcher. And he talks about these endocrine disrupting chemicals with these short half-lives as being like drive-by chemicals. So even though they're in there for a short time, they'll shoot the place up and then peace out. And now you're left with all this damage that they've left. And so the best way is not to address those. It's not through some detox protocol. Like detox protocols have their place, but when we're talking about non-persistent chemicals, the absolute number one thing that you do to get them out of your body is stop bringing them into your body. That's it. That's how you deal with non-persistent chemicals. So if we stop bringing them in, there's nothing to excrete. And so an example of like an intervention in this way is I think there's at this point maybe 5 or 6 different studies that have looked at the consumption of organic food versus conventional food, and the pesticides that are present in conventional foods, which are the most concerning. And they look at, okay, well, what happens, let's measure the metabolites of pesticides in the urine of people eating conventional foods. Then let's switch them to an organic diet, and we'll see how quickly those pesticide levels drop in the urine. You can reduce your pesticide load by eating mostly organic, that's not 100%, it's really hard. Mostly organic drops your circulating pesticide levels by 80 to 90% in 3 to 5 days. That's you just by avoiding it. That's it. That's what we do. We don't need big detox protocols for that. We just need avoidance. We do need detox protocols for other things that are harder to get rid of. So heavy metals, some of those persistent chemicals. So we do both. So I look at our approach to addressing chemicals as twofold. Number one thing we do is we turn the volume down as much as possible on our exposure. That means we modify our behaviors, our lifestyle, our purchasing habits. At the same time that we're doing that, we are turning the volume up on our detox capacity. That doesn't mean detox protocols. That means we're eating nutrient-dense foods that provide our body, our liver in particular, the nutrients that it needs to do its job. So eat those cruciferous vegetables, the broccoli, the kale, the cabbage, the cauliflower, like all of the onions, the garlics, the alliums, all of those foods provide our body with the nutrients that it needs to do a really good job of detoxing. And then we can add in sauna and binders and stuff like that. But I think that we can really simplify this health optimization when it comes to toxins. We typically don't need, big, involved, complicated, expensive protocols. We just need to minimize our exposure and optimize our natural detox process that's working 24/7 anyway.
Pretty simple advice right there. I got to keep it simple there. That's one thing I like about your teaching is that you keep it simple and don't try to get too technical with, the average person, because then you lose them. Either it's over their head or
Absolutely.
All right, Laura, I think I could talk to you the rest of the day, but is it if the listeners want to get a hold of you or find out more information about yourself, where can they go?
They can either go to my website, which is just laraadler.com, or over to my Instagram, which is Environmental Toxins Nerd over on IG. Got tons of good info over there.
Okay, I'll make sure to link that up, and thanks for being on today.
Yeah, thank you.
I hope you enjoyed that episode with Laura. There was a lot of information in this show, and like I said in the interview, we could have expanded on any one of the topics we discussed. But to summarize what you need to know as an individual living in the real world is first, and most importantly, to reduce exposure of environmental toxins. Second is to support your body's detox pathways. And finally, if you're still experiencing symptoms or would like to improve your health even more, do a detox that can help eliminate the chemicals that are not so easily reduced by the first 2 steps. I urge you to continue your own education around environmental toxins from experts like Laura. To learn more about what environmental toxins may be harmful to your health and ways to reduce your exposure. Remember, just because the amount of these toxins may be small, doesn't mean they can't have a negative effect on your health or the health of future generations. And with that said, this is Coach Strick saying thanks for listening. And remember, when calories in, calories out doesn't work, that, my friend, is a calorie conundrum.
This podcast, including Coach Strick and guests, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects for the use of any information contained herein. Coach Strick and/or guests may recommend products or services in which they have a direct or indirect financial interest. To find out more, please visit www.calorieconundrum.com.